All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Matthew Connolly. I'm the co-director, along with Tom Dupree, of the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy. We are the Social Science Institute of Columbia. So our role is to support and to promote research and public engagement. I'm just delighted to see how it is. Our senior research scholar, Wilmot James, has mounted this incredibly impressive series of events on the history and future of planetary threats. He's basically done all the work, and I won't try to take any of the credit. I will say, though, that if I had any influence, it was in making sure that we try to look at these things, not just in terms of the future, right, trying to anticipate future threats, much less the present crisis, but also we try to take the longer view. And in fact, I'll just briefly say that this is the fifth and final event of the series we've had this year. We've heard from, and you will see, if you look in the chat, you'll see links to these talks. We've heard from Ernest Moniz on the Nuclear Threat Initiative. We heard Fareed Zakaria on 10 lessons for the post-pandemic world. So definitely taking the longer view. But then we also had a symposium on vaccines and global public health. We also had one on crisis communications and vaccine uptake in fragile African settings. So we've both, looked at some of the research on these topics, but we've also taken a longer view. And I'm just delighted then to turn things over to Wilmot to introduce this panel on advanced warning systems and forecasting outbreaks. Over to you, Wilmot.
So thank you very much, Matt, and welcome to everybody for joining us today. Today's meeting will focus on advanced warning systems and forecasting outbreaks, an overview of the National Center for Epidemic Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics. We're very happy that we have among the best experts in the field with us. I look forward to co-moderating the session with Alex Halliday today. And just to say that Alex is the director of Columbia's Earth Institute. He joined the Earth Institute in 2018 after spending more than a decade at the University of Oxford, during which time he was a Dean of Science and Engineering there. So thanks, Alex, for doing this with me in terms of the co-moderation. If I can introduce the two speakers who will take us through the National Center, the plan for the National Center for Epidemic Forecasting. And let me just say by way of background that on the first full day in office, the Biden-Harris administration announced an intention to create this National Center for Epidemic Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics. The administration also requested funding to support this effort, and that you'll see in the American Rescue Plan. It's modeled after the National Weather Service. This Epidemic Forecasting Center would help public health officials anticipate and respond to outbreaks before they grow into epidemics or pandemics. This capability must be developed, it noted, to ensure that the country, this is the USA, is never caught unprepared again. So this is a big subject, and this is a plan that has now evolved, and we're very pleased to have two of the people involved in the design of this plan. The first is Caitlin Rivers, who is a senior scholar at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and she is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering there. Research focuses on improving public health preparedness and response, particularly by improving capabilities for outbreak science and infectious disease modeling to support public health decision-making. So Caitlin participated as an author or contributor in influential reports that are guiding the US response to COVID-19 today. So welcome to Caitlin. If I can introduce Dylan George then, who is the Vice President of an organization called In-Q-Tel. You would know of this. Dylan supports technical evaluations of life science and healthcare deals, drives strategic science and technical vision to strengthen capacity within the United States to counter biological threats from infectious disease epidemics. He served on the Biden transition team supporting national security and foreign policy, and the agency review team for the Department of Health and Human Services. So there, by way of introduction, just to thank both Dylan and Caitlin for doing this. And we certainly look forward to what it is you're going to discuss with us. Over to you, Dylan and Caitlin.
Great, I can go ahead and kick us off. And thanks again so much for having us. We're really excited to be here and share some of the thinking that we have around why this is such an important capability. So I want to first start out by laying out a few central challenges that I think epidemiology as a field is facing. The first is that outbreaks keep happening way more than people realize. It's not just COVID that is a 1 in 100-year event that we face. It's about every 2 years that we face serious public health threats, from SARS in 2003, H1N1 in 2009, more recently COVID, Ebola, Zika. These events really do keep happening. And they're not just a grave threat to human life and health, but they also disrupt economic activity. And I think that's why we need to change our thinking from this being a once in a while sort of situation to something that can really be a national security threat. And it's not just the outbreaks that make the headlines that we worry about. There are a lot of health security threats that don't even rise to the attention of entering the public consciousness. In 2020, there were 74 disease outbreak news event reports published by the World Health Organization. And in 2019, there were almost 120. And to make the list, in order to have a disease outbreak news alert issued, an outbreak must be of unknown cause of significant health concern, a known cause with a demonstrated serious public health impact, or one of high public concern. So not only are these events common, but they're also quite serious. And they are, of course, difficult to control. The COVID pandemic has been ongoing for 16 months, and we have a lot ahead of us. In 2014, there was a serious outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. That outbreak infected nearly 30,000 people and took 2 years to control. And even now, there's another outbreak of Ebola ongoing in Guinea, and several recent ones in the Democratic Republic of Congo have been challenging to control. And so these major events happen often, and they cause serious extended disruption, and they're often very difficult to get back into hand. So what can we do about them? Medical countermeasures are the thing that most people turn to first when evaluating the options that we have in order to address these health security threats. And I do think the development of vaccines is one of humanity's greatest achievements, certainly one of the greatest public health achievements. And so it's not to say that vaccines don't play an important role in therapeutics, but they cannot solve every problem. Research and development is slow and it's expensive, and that's not the only hard part. Even when we have a vaccine in hand, we found new failure modes over and over again for how we can bring that to bear on emerging infectious diseases. And so I think medical countermeasures are a tool in our toolkit, but they cannot be the only tool in the toolkit. Just a few examples of where we have had to contend with a period between when an outbreak emerged and when we had a vaccine to bring to bear. In 2017, there was a major shortage of the yellow fever vaccine that coincided with a major outbreak. WHO had to institute fractional dosing in order to be able to extend coverage of the vaccine to as many people who needed it. And of course, in COVID, even though we have developed a vaccine in record time, well beyond what would have seemed possible even a couple of years ago, we still had almost an entire year of a pandemic to contend with without vaccines. And I do want to spend one more moment thinking about the specific example of the Ebola vaccine. Thanks to a long history of investing in Ebola research, though in retrospect, not enough investment, there were several candidate products in research and development available to move into clinical trials when the West Africa Ebola outbreak hit. But even with that head start, even having products in the R&D pipeline, it was not until the outbreak had largely been brought under control with traditional public health measures that the vaccines were ready to field for clinical trials. And even now, 5 years later, when we do have vaccines that are authorized for use and that are known to be safe and effective against Ebola, we still face challenges in controlling Ebola outbreaks. A recent outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo took almost 2 years to control. And again, that was after the vaccine had completed development. And so all of this is to say that we can't have medical countermeasures be the only thing that we rely upon. We need other capabilities that we can develop and incorporate into outbreak response. And I think this means we need more innovation. The field of epidemiology is built on data and data analytics. And I think that's where a lot of new innovation can come from even still. There's an old story about the founding of epidemiology that I think every epidemiologist knows. And it goes that in 1854, there was a cholera outbreak in London. And at the time, it wasn't recognized that cholera spread through water. It was thought it was caused by bad air. But a man named John Snow had his doubts about the bad air hypothesis. And he had an inkling that water had something to do with it. And so he went door to door and asked people where they fetched their water from and whether their household had a case of cholera. And he put that on a map. And he identified clustering around a specific pump. And someone went out and removed the pump handle and the outbreak was stopped. Now, it could be that that's allegorical. I know we have a historian on the line who will probably tell me that I shouldn't take that story too seriously. But I do think it says a lot about how we can use data and epidemiology in order to make decisions. And I think that's one of the tools that we need to keep in our toolkit along with medical countermeasure development. And so this is where outbreak data and modeling comes in. There's so much that we can do with data and modeling to support outbreak response. Most common output is a forecast or the expected future number of cases. And a related analysis is nowcasting, which is trying to understand how many current cases there are that have not yet made it through the surveillance pipeline. And one kind of forecast that you're probably very familiar with is from weather forecasts, which tell us what we can expect in the next few hours or days or sometimes weeks. And we use this information to make all kinds of decisions about whether we should go to the park this weekend or whether we should bring an umbrella. And we really use that information to change our behaviors and to make decisions in our lives. But that personal use of weather forecasts is actually a late addition to the weather enterprise. A lot of the original impetus was for economic reasons. Cargo ships wanted to know whether their ships would meet any storms. The airline industry wants to know whether it's safe to deploy aircraft based on weather. And so a lot of the uses of weather forecasting were not foreseen until we already had that capability in hand. And I think that says something too about what we can expect for disease forecasting. We can think of a lot of ways that it will be useful now, but I think when we have accurate and reliable disease forecasts, we will find even more uses for how that can be implemented in our everyday lives. There's various other uses of modeling and data analytics. It's not just forecasting, although I think that's the most evocative. And so that's kind of what I like to call upon to help people to understand why I think this is so important. But there are other important analyses that we use all the time in disease modeling. Comparing interventions is a common one. Often when you're responding to an outbreak, you don't have unlimited resources, to say the least of it. And so knowing which interventions are likely to be most effective, to be able to prioritize is really valuable for helping decision makers to direct resources efficiently and effectively. I will note here that the experienced epidemiologists and public health decision makers, they already have a very good intuition about how to respond to an outbreak, whether it's better to do A or B or C. But even still, even though knowing that there are experts who do this intuitively, I think it's still really important to have models to be able to interrogate your understanding, to play out different scenarios, and to really structure thinking around what the questions are on the table are, what the possible options are, and how they might stack against each other. There's one other, going back to the 2014 Ebola outbreak, there's one other observation from that outbreak that I think illustrates how it's not just fancy data analytics that has value, it's also improving data quality and availability that is really important for making all of the rest of these fancy approaches work. In 2014, in affected communities, the infrastructure for data collection was not well developed, and there were issues with quality. Data elements were missing, they were duplicated. This happens all the time in public health data. It was not specific to that outbreak. But one of the problems that we didn't have in the 2014 Ebola outbreak is that all of the 3 affected countries collected the exact same data. And that's because in advance of that outbreak, there was a case report form that was developed by Africa CDC in collaboration, I believe, with US CDC, that enumerated the different fields that should be collected during an Ebola outbreak: demographics, exposure information, clinical information. And that little bit of foresight of putting together this form and making sure that that public health departments had it meant that it could be pulled off the shelf when the Ebola outbreak hit. And that little intervention really changed the quality and availability of the data that we had from that outbreak. And I think that goes to show that if we put some structure and we put some motivation around these putting these puzzle places in place, you know what I mean, that it can really get us to a better place when a crisis hits. And I think that's an important example. How it works right now around data modeling and analysis is that right now in the US, there's a robust community of academics. I'm an academic myself who volunteer their expertise when there is a crisis. And it's really that wealth of expertise and that generosity to step into the breach that has powered the COVID response. It also powered the Zika response and the Ebola response. And I think that although I'm very grateful for that expertise, and again, I'm an academic myself, I don't think we can carry on like that. That's not how we structure national defense. It's not how we structure weather forecasting. A capability that we rely on so heavily to guide our national interests is something that we should institutionalize. We should make sure that it's resourced and fit for purpose. And that's why I'm so excited about this National Center for Epidemic Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics. As Wilmot mentioned, it was announced in National Security Directive 1 that the Biden administration intends to establish this sort of a center. $500 million was appropriated on the American Rescue Package. That money went to CDC in order to implement this center. Some of that money is also for public health data modernization, which goes back to my Ebola example about how important it is to invest not just in the fancy analytics, but also in the data. And so I'm really excited to see this center come into existence, and I'm excited to see how it changes and supports our outbreak response, not just for COVID, because this crisis will at some point end, hopefully, but also for the next crisis that we know is happening and the one after that. And this is going to be a really important permanent capability for our long-term interests. So in close, after every crisis, not just in public health, but generally, there's a period of reflection where we assess what we can do better next time. And that's because we know that there will be a next time, there always is, and we can expect another infectious disease threat in this case as well. And it's excruciatingly clear that now that it is in our national interest to be ready. I think that outbreak forecasting and analytics is really key to that readiness, and I think this center is going to help us get there. And I will pass it now over to my colleague Dylan George to round us out.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you all today. I appreciate the organizers, Wilmot, Matthew, for putting this all together. Just wanted to add a few framing comments and foot stomps to what Caitlin has said. You know, we live in an age of pandemics. Pandemics are and will continue to be a major national security threat. This administration will face more, if not multiple, public health emergencies during its time in office. And it's interesting that over the past 10, 15 years, we actually had to try to convince people that we actually live in this age of pandemics. I think it's painfully clear now that this is true. Given the constant threat and the significant potential impact, we need to meet this current moment, and we need to prepare for persistent future threats going forward. We're a bit at an inflection point in public health, I believe. In recent decades, governments, particularly the United States government, drove objectives and funding for global health goals. COVID-19 has shown that single point failures are costly, and an ecosystem of stakeholders is needed. This definitely includes governments, but it also includes non-governmental organizations, civil society, volunteers, and the private sector. Caitlin and I had the honor of helping in the Biden transition with preparing for COVID-related policies, as was already noted. In that time, we had the privilege of meeting with many companies and organizations and volunteers. I particularly was humbled by how many of these people were working and how many of these companies were investing at risk or even against their own interest in order to help with the pandemic response. It was absolutely inspired and inspirational. It was very clear to me in those discussions that significant capacity and capabilities lie in the private sector and civil society, and we need to find ways of taking advantage of that to more effect going forward. Seeing those people meet the moment helped me realize that reinforcing this ecosystem will help us with future ones that are assuredly coming down the way. You know, incidentally, in the United States, we have explicitly accepted the need for the private sector involvement in manufacturing vaccines and drugs. To manufacture vaccines at scale, we turn to the private sector. The J&Js, the AstraZenecas, the Pfizers, the Mercks of this world are the people that do that. Without a doubt, the government has a clear role in driving the funding, the requirements, de-risking the science, et cetera. But the private sector is manufacturing the products. And so there's this really interesting public-private interface. To manufacture at scale, we needed the skills and the capabilities that were resident within the private sector. COVID has demonstrated that we similarly need to be explicit about the need for private sector involvement in data systems to guide public health responses. If vaccines are mission critical and we lean on the private sector to build them, why are we not doing the same for mission critical capabilities like data systems that guide public health interventions? This is going to be a pressing question in the months and years ahead. One suggestion that I would like to at least posit into the discussion is to learn from what enabled making vaccines for pandemics. After 9/11, the United States government realized that we needed to make vaccines faster, especially those that fell prey to market failures, namely the pandemic vaccines, like what we're seeing with COVID. This would require working with the private sector in a different way than was done before on the part of the federal government. The Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, was created in part to enable these public-private partnerships that would be needed to push forward these critical vaccines. Now, I used to work at BARDA, so I have a very soft spot in my heart for the organization and their mission. I would be the first one to admit that there are warts associated with BARDA. It's not a perfect organization by any means, but it is very good at engaging the private sector and moving things forward in a public way for a public good. The federal government has struggled with data technologies and attracting data scientists. This is a well-known problem. It's no different within for data systems within public health. These systems are legacy systems. They're decades old. These systems need to be modernized, and the private sector has to play a major role. I've been enamored with this idea of finding new ways for the federal government in particular, to engage the private sector on data technology. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be straightforward. But I think that we need to meet this moment and to move it forward such that the private sector and public health can work together hand in hand more effectively. So perhaps we do need a BARDA for data technology and public health. So similarly, we live in this age of pandemics. We also live in an age of emerging technologies. As Caitlin pointed out, and we are all painfully aware from our common experience with COVID, when a novel pathogen emerges, we will not have drugs or vaccines to protect us. As great an accomplishment as it has been to make the vaccines at scale, and as fast as has been done, we are still over a year into the pandemic, and people and communities are fatigued and hurting. Vaccines and drugs have been helpful and well received in this fight, but it's only been recently. The things that have been helping us fight this vaccine is exactly what Caitlin talked about. The public health interventions, the wearing masks, washing hands, washing our distance, staying at home. These all measures have kept us safe. They're critical tools in the fight. Data and analytics can allow us to guide these interventions for maximal effect, and hopefully to minimize the adverse effects that we see, particularly economically. Unfortunately, the current data systems have slowed our response, and they are challenged in trying to keep pace. The country has stumbled in using data and analytics to guide our response, and it's humbling that we live in a country that has transformed the world with data technology, and our healthcare and public health data systems remain decades old and not fit for purpose. I have been inspired and humbled at the volunteer efforts by multiple people and groups. Two exceptional efforts have been the Johns Hopkins University site and the COVID tracking project. We were all using their site to track the pandemic for a really long time, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for their work and their sacrifice. They sacrificed to actually do that for us. Their efforts helped us to understand what was happening with the virus. So we need to capitalize on efforts like those and take advantage of the technologies that we can find. As Wilmot mentioned, I'm very encouraged that the Biden administration and Congress has supported the idea of strengthening public health data, the overall public health data pipeline, and specifically this National Center for Epidemic Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics. This center, we do believe, will help help people make decisions faster, better, stronger, so that we can maximize the impact of responses and minimize the adverse effects. So we need to figure out how to do this more effectively, and the center will be a focal point for bringing that together. This is important work. It's currently being done, as Caitlin pointed out, a lot of this work is being done by volunteers in academia, in civil society, and in the private sector. These folks are typically not paid, they're not organized or formally tasked to support these efforts, but the center would bring them together and professionalize this service and make it able to move at speed and scale in a completely different way. Now, there's a couple key components that we think about with the center as well. And so, we've chatted with colleagues that have worked in weather and hurricane forecasting, and there's a couple key components that have been allowed them to be successful. For weather forecasting, they've developed systems that operate at least 3 levels: improving the science and developing new capabilities, translating that science into technology, and then lastly, interpreting the results at the local level. Organizations like the National Center for Atmospheric Research focus on improving the science of forecasting. We have translated the best of science into operationalized technology in the National Weather Service to forecast daily. Then we have a system of local meteorologists that are interpreting the models for local consumption and decision making. This system, albeit simplistically described, allows for improving the science, the technology, and the communication of results so people can use that information to protect themselves and their loved ones. And so for this center to be really successful, it needs to be focused on helping decision makers make decisions bigger, faster, stronger. If it does not accomplish that function, then we need to reallocate resources to something that can. So this center should live or die on its ability to do that. I did want to take one moment as well to kind of discuss, because there's some competing ideas as well about the idea of analyzing, anticipating emerging events versus analyzing ongoing outbreaks. Many of us know that most infectious diseases in the humans come from pathogens that circulate in animal populations. Ebola, Zika, and many coronaviruses originally came from animal reservoirs, spilled over into humans. And researchers are working to understand the spillover dynamics in a hope that we can eventually anticipate spillovers, and particularly the spillovers that would cause major outbreaks. This incorporates ecological, social, behavioral, virological, immunological components, among others, to try to understand those major drivers. If we can identify those spillover dynamics, then we potentially could stop the spillover from happening. It's an area of research that many people are focusing on. When I was in the White House during the Obama administration, we called efforts to anticipate spillover and disease emergence as prediction. It's just a term of art that we used more than anything else. This kind of work was distinct, at least in my mind, from using analytics to understand an ongoing outbreak, like how Caitlin described it. And so the projections of an ongoing outbreak and looking around the corner as to what would happen, that's what we called forecasting. But this full spectrum of alerting, risk characterization, scenario planning, and then this forecasting component is all of what we would call outbreak science. And so I think that we will make the most progress the fastest on forecasting and supporting decision-making for outbreak response and over prediction of spillover events. For me, the near-term focus should be on forecasting and outbreak science. But having said all of that, I am exceptionally encouraged that the Biden and Harris administration has mandated efforts and included the resources for funding the data modernization initiative for more genomic sequencing so that we can understand what's happening with the variants, and the National Center for Epidemic Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics. I'm also very encouraged that, as the administration put out last week, that they're recommending an increase in funding for the CDC generally in their most recent budget proposal. These initiatives can transform data and analytics, our ability to effectively guide interventions. And these capabilities will put us in a much better position to respond to future pandemics that we know will come. So I will stop there. With that, I will conclude. I very much look forward to learning from Jeff and Jim from their comments, and then also chatting with you as we go into the Q&A. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much to you, Dylan and Caitlin, for walking us through the fundamental importance of improving data collection and refining our ability to be more predictive and more anticipatory when it comes to disease outbreaks. So that was really fabulous. Dylan and Caitlin are also quite modest. They played leadership roles within the US policymaking environment on a number of occasions. And if you haven't read the Biden-Harris plan for dealing with COVID-19, look at that last paragraph. The design for that, they had a lot to do with it. So thank you very much, both for your leadership and for your skill, and for your contribution on the academic and intellectual front in dealing with two key issues. As you could hear, you may know, colleagues, that the United States is playing catch up here. There are other countries who have similar institutions. Europe does, and so does Hong Kong and a few other places. It's trying to catch up. And the reason why it's catching up is because of the vision of the Biden administration, Harris administration. This is going to be a step change. And so we're quite keen to both contribute to the building up of this institution. And so this is a really nice moment for us to be having this conversation. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Alex Halliday. And as I mentioned, he is the director of Columbia University's Earth Institute. And he will then introduce our panelists and then lead the discussion after that with me. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much indeed, Wilmot. And this is a great and very interesting panel to be associated with. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce Jeff Shayman, who is a professor in environmental health services. He's also director of the Climate and Health Program in the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. As of this year, he also is the new chair of the Earth Institute faculty. So Jeff Shayman's background is in biology, but for his PhD, he worked on modeling climate variability and its impacts. Excuse me. Today, he studies the environmental determinants of health with a strong focus on infectious disease, including flu and COVID-19. He's going to talk to us about, if I can actually finish the sentence, improving infectious disease forecasting. Thank you. Over to you.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Good. Please get a glass of water. And thank you, Wilmot, and thank you, Matt, for organizing this. Dylan, Caitlin, it's a pleasure being here with you. And Jim, it's also a pleasure being with you. I look forward to your comments. So I was asked to speak a little bit about improving infectious disease forecasting in the context that Dylan described forecasting. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I actually have a few slides to help. Maybe the visualizations will help a bit. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll go from there. So, whoops, let's get to the first slide. So as Caitlin alluded, you know, I imagine much of the center will be organized around data acquisition, organization, sharing, as well as analytics that will use a variety of statistical, machine learning, and mathematical approaches to understanding it. A lot of the work that goes into understanding infectious disease leverages mathematical methods and mathematical modeling. And there are really three types of things that we try to do with these models of infectious disease. One is to simulate and infer or estimate the properties that guide the transmission dynamics of these diseases at scale. A second has to do with using those models, be they mathematical or statistical or otherwise, to project future outcomes, how much disease burden there will be, how much transmission will be, where it's going to spread, et cetera. So that falls in the scope of forecasting. And the third would be to explore counterfactuals, interventions, and the ways in which we might intervene or blunt the effects of an infectious disease as we anticipate it will roll out in the future. Now, I'm going to focus on the second of those, which is forecasting. And I have this simple pictograph here that shows you really where I look at forecasts and how they lie in what I think of as really a continuum of information that we have with infectious diseases. And that information starts with observations, which provide indications of what has happened in the past, incidents of disease, cases, deaths, transmission hotspots, things that are recorded in an observational record. It progresses to the present, where the information gets a lot more gappy. There happen to be a lot of lags in the reporting of information, and very often we'll use statistical methods to try to supplement the limited observations that we have in real time, and we call those nowcasts. It's an effort to try to fill in the gaps and create a more complete picture of what's going on in the here and now. And then it extends into the future with these models that we use dynamically, statistically, or otherwise to project what conditions will be like in the future. Now, as you move from the past to the present to the future, we have these little error bars that I've drawn around each of these. They tend to get a bit larger. So the uncertainty of the estimates and our understanding of what will happen, the information about the past or the observation, it tends to be more constrained. When you move to the present, you get nowcasts, it tends to increase a bit, and the uncertainty tends to be greatest when you're projecting what's going to happen in the future, because there are many factors that we may not understand, and that we have a limited understanding of what will actually happen as things roll out in the coming weeks and months. Now, that doesn't always have to be the case. There can be very good forecasts that are very accurate, and there are observations that are frankly lousy, that have enormous uncertainty or error around them. So it's actually quite variable, but this is a tendency that we have. Now, any judicious, intelligent use of any of these pieces of information wants to account for that uncertainty. You would like to know if your observations are good or highly uncertain, and you would like to use that information when you're making a decision based on that information. If you know that the observations are not good, you're going to discount them more. If you know they're of high quality, you're going to pay more attention to them. The same thing goes for the nowcasts and the forecasts. Now, as part of the scientific inquiry in our efforts to improve forecasting, nowcasting, and even observations, we want to shrink those error bars. So it's the job of the scientific community and hopefully this national center to start to bring those error bars in more tightly so that we have more reliable, calibrated, accurate information at our disposal, be it for the past, present, or future, so that we can understand what the disease threats that we have experienced are, what the conditions are right now, and what will be confronting us in the weeks and months into the future. So I'm going to give you an example of what a forecast looks like. And this is an example of an operational real-time forecast that my group did for seasonal influenza during the 2012-13 season for Salt Lake City. This is obviously in the United States. It is week 50 of 2012. That's around December 15th. And the forecast was initiated roughly on that date. What you're seeing here with the black X's are observations of influenza-like illness plus, which is an estimate of influenza in the community of Salt Lake City from the weeks 40 to 50 in black X's. The red X's show observations that we did not have in hand at the time, that ultimately, obviously, as this is now in the past, we know. What you're seeing with the blue line is what's called a posterior fit by an ensemble of models, multiple models, each one of which is collected in an ensemble itself. And then with the gray lines, what you're seeing are the forecasts, the projections into the future running out about 10 weeks that we made with each of these 200-member ensembles. There are 150 of these 200-member ensembles. Each gray line depicts the mean forecast or projection. And what you can see from the gray lines is that they're doing a number of things actually pretty well. It's predicting that the peak is going to be in about 5 weeks, which is in fact when it took place. It's getting the overall duration of the outbreak, and the area under the curve, the total infectious burden, is being captured by this forecast. Now that peak, that red X, is well above those gray lines, but they are the mean of ensemble, and as I'll show you in a moment, they're actually statistically well captured by this prediction. Now, we can make this prediction when we're doing well for something that's recurrent like seasonal influenza, for which the properties are stationary and don't vary that much. And it's great that we could say with this prediction at week 50, we're saying that in 5 weeks, there'll be a peak of influenza in Salt Lake City and be right. But we would like to do more than that. We don't simply want to predict that it will happen in 5 weeks. We want to know the certainty of that forecast. This is very analogous to a weather forecast. They don't simply tell you it will rain tomorrow. They'll say it's an 80% chance of rain tomorrow or a 20% chance of rain tomorrow. We want that kind of calibrated statistical reliability in our infectious disease forecasts that we've come to know and trust in weather forecasts. And it turns out we can begin to pull that out by going into one of those gray lines. So if I pick one of those gray lines here and tease it apart to show you the full ensemble that's under it, it looks something like this. It's a bit more of spaghetti. And you can see that the ensemble spans the observations in the future, which statistically is very good. But what we've also been able to see is that if we look at the disagreement among the individual simulations or projections, the forecasts there, we can use that to make an estimation of how certain we are of the forecast. When there are more in agreement, there's higher certainty in the forecast. And when there's more divergence in those green lines, there's less certainty in the forecast. And we can actually use that to say there's a 70% chance that flu will peak in 5 weeks versus a 10% chance that flu will peak in 5 weeks. Both of them are giving the same mean prediction, but the certainty associated with it is very different. One may be actionable and one upon which an organization, a hospital, a public health agency may want to respond. So we have the capability of generating these types of forecasts. And we've certainly seen for COVID-19 what I call projections rather than forecasts, because there's so much that civil society is doing to try to disrupt the pandemic. It's very hard to predict what policies and actions and levels of compliance there will be from community to community in combating the disease. So they're less statistically reliable and they're more what I would call projections rather than forecasts. But we want to, with a system like this, both in academia and certainly through this National Center, to try to further research this and to develop more reliable forecasting models, try all sorts of alternate model forms, statistical, mathematical, hybrid, age stratified, look at within host forecasting processes, think about multiple strains and those dynamics, think about spatially explicit or cross-scale models. We want to improve the optimization techniques that we use to actually fit those models to past observations in order to actually generate a reliable calibrated projection. And that includes a lot of investment in what are called data assimilation methods, sequential Monte Carlo techniques, Bayesian inference, and other types of means of fitting nonlinear systems to observations. We want to improve the observations as well. That is a very big issue. We need to access private or novel data streams. We need to get these organized. We want to reduce observational error and improve those observational systems. And we want to improve the availability of these data in real time so that the work of nowcasting is reduced and there's a richer complement of data available to support forecasting future outcomes and understanding what's going on in the present. And lastly, we certainly want to deliver and archive the forecast for integrated use and decision-making. We have some technological and structural investments that need to be made, and we need to work with public health, medical, and business sectors in order to integrate the use and adoption of these models and projections in a very sensible and informed way that doesn't oversell or undersell their capabilities. Now, I'm just going to give you a couple examples of this. One might be a study of nonlinear error growth in these models. The systems we're depicting, much like the weather and the atmosphere, are nonlinear, and they have some funny dynamics that need to be understood. And we need to understand how error grows within these systems in order to control for it, compensate, and handle it when making forecasts. This is an area that's actually been invested in considerably in numerical weather prediction, and we need that kind of investment for infectious diseases as well. We also have big issues with observations. It's been alluded to by both Caitlin and Dylan, and I'm going to give you an example here from my own work. This was a study that was led by Nick DeFelice, who's at Mount Sinai, who was a postdoc with me at the time, to develop a retrospective system for forecasting West Nile virus, which is an endemic arbovirus in the United States at this point. It emerged back in 1999. And what we were able to show retrospectively is that we can make forecasts using mosquito infectious pool data and human case data of human cases well in advance of the burden. If you look at the lower stream here, you're seeing observations of infections of humans, and you're seeing forecasts made where the black X's tell you the observations in hand, and the red X's are future cumulative cases. And you can see the predictions at different points in time as you go from left to right, week 29 through week 35. And you can see that by the time you get to week 31, which is well in advance of when most of the infections take place and wind up in the hospital, we're able to predict the burden in this county of West Nile virus. However, we can make this forecast retrospectively because all the data are in hand. In reality, West Nile virus, even though it's a notifiable disease, there's a 2 to 12 week delay between a person being diagnosed or tested for West Nile virus and it actually being officially confirmed and made available through public health channels. And a 3-month delay is much too long to support real-time forecasting as we would like to engage in. So we're not capable of making a West Nile virus forecast simply because the data are not operationally available in real time. So we need to accelerate those pathways for returning information on disease burden for something like this disease system. Last thing I'm going to show is one of my favorite graphics. This shows you a time series of the history of numerical weather prediction over a 60-year span. It roughly started in the mid-1950s. Obviously, this stops at about 2013, so the plot's a little bit old, but it continues. It shows a field that's halfway up the atmosphere over North America and the ability of the NCEP operational forecast to actually predict that. Skill increases as you go upward, and you see 36-hour and 72-hour forecasts. The thing that's important to look at is that monotonically, the skill of these forecasts, their accuracy, their ability to deliver useful information increases over time. And it's increased over time because of investment, because we have a National Center for Environmental Prediction that's part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and linked to NCAR and the National Weather Service. And they've been investing in understanding the atmosphere and its dynamics at a fundamental level, as well as integrating academic research on it and building better models and improving computational capacity and building data assimilation methods to ingest observations and improving the observational network. All those things have happened over this 60-year span of time to greatly increase the skill of the weather forecasts that we receive. And they are appreciably better than they were, for instance, when I was growing up. We need the same kind of investment for infectious disease forecasting, and a national center will allow us to actually bring that together, consolidate it, archive it, and systematically begin making the improvements so that we can keep the United States and other parts of the world safe. So I will stop there, and I thank you for your attention.
Jeff, thank you so much. That was great, fantastic, very inspiring. And it was nice that you ended up on the note of history, because that takes us very neatly to our next speaker, who is James Flemming, who's the Charles Dana Professor of Science, Technology and Society at Colby College, Maine. Jim's background is in astronomy, and then he did atmospheric science, but he gained his PhD in history from Princeton. His books include Meteorology in America, Historical Perspectives on Climate Change, The Calendar Effect, Fixing the Sky, Inventing Atmospheric Science, and First Woman, Joanne Simpson and the Tropical Atmosphere. She was the first woman to receive a PhD in meteorology in the United States. Jim is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Meteorological Society, and he's founder and first president of the International Commission on History of Meteorology. His opinions are sought by Congress, the National Academy of Sciences, and the International Panel on Climate Change. So Jim, you're going to talk to us about weather forecasting and historical perspective.
Thank you very much, Alex. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this group, because it's so inspirational. I wish Caitlin and Dylan best wishes on the analogy here to the weather forecasting. And I thank the organizers for this opportunity. The history of weather forecasting is just over 100 years old in the modern sense. In 1904, Norwegian physicist Wilhelm Bjerknes cast the problem of weather forecasting as a problem in mechanics and physics. What we need, he said, was a sufficiently accurate knowledge of the state of the atmosphere at the initial time, and a sufficiently accurate knowledge of the laws according to which one state of the atmosphere develops from the other. He didn't emphasize sufficiently, but I did, because a perfectly exact measurement, a perfectly exact knowledge is not available to the meteorologist. But sufficiently tends to work as you try to do a time step forecast. He called the knowledge of the state of the atmosphere, he called it diagnosis, kind of a medical analogy. And then the development of the future weather, he called it prognosis. So he was definitely using sort of medical analogies, but was dealing with physical laws. He had his statement was a statement of rational mechanics, of faith that the the equations would give him the next step and state of the atmosphere. And he was able to raise certain fundamental questions about how far into the future we could see. The time-dependent equations of atmospheric motion, and I think the group here is very aware of that, are intertwined tangle of nonlinear influences. And I've called them the Gordian knot of meteorology. And if you could untie this knot, you could provide provision of the weather for 10 days, for seasons, perhaps for next year, for climatic conditions, much longer. But these equations have no exact solution. Realizing that hand computations would proceed slower than the weather would be changing, the Norwegian or Bergen School in 1919 developed a graphical method of weather analysis and forecasting. They started with observations, and their quest was to have a uniform system of observations of a sufficient density, lots of them taken on a regular plan. But then the next step is analysis of the data. So the most famous book in the field of weather forecasting is really called Weather Analysis and Forecasting, because the precision analysis of the observations is what really is the important first step. And then you have to have a model to impose upon your analysis. And they had the air mass analysis model and the polar front cyclone model in Norway. But all three elements are necessary in both theory and practice. And responding to Dylan's comment about societal needs, weather forecasting was co-produced with societal needs. And so that's a very important aspect of this. First, you could say in the 18th and 19th centuries with Western settlement, the needs of agriculture, then with shipping and commerce, and then in the 20th century with aviation and space systems, increasingly driven by military and security needs. When we mention large corporations from the private sector involved in national weather enterprise, we think of Lockheed Martin and Ball Aerospace and very large corporations who develop the space systems. I wanted to share a couple of reasons for caution as I read the original article in Foreign Affairs, because the Gordian knot has no analytical solution and only approximate graphical solutions. It's based on well understood physical quantities like pressure, temperature, moisture, and the like, but it's not based on rather poorly understood human transmission factors as we're dealing with in the case of pandemics. But in the middle of the 20th century, some transformative technologies, kind of like Alexander's sword, began cutting into the Gordian knot of provision. Rather than untangling it, they cut through it with general use technologies not created or built by the meteorologists. I mentioned radar and satellites providing new observational tools, and then digital computer models crunching the numbers many times faster than the weather changes. So you can do the computations at light speed. Jeff showed the 500 millibar computer forecast, and this is where the models are best because that's where the flow of the atmosphere is friction-free. There's no heating to take into account. There's no moisture to amount to much of anything. And so it's a much simpler computation than trying to predict the weather at the surface. This is upper air forecasting that was done from the 1950s. Even so, even though we're making progress and we are getting better at combining both the observations and the models, running them really as in a sequence that's iterated just about every microsecond. Even so, there's a new Gordian knot of meteorology emerging, or it emerged in 1960, involving a computation sensitivity to initial conditions. This was what Ed Lorenz brought us with chaos theory. And that holds that small differences in initial conditions can produce very great differences in the final outcome. So even today, with the progress we've made, and we have made quite a bit, there's currently a 7 to 10 day theoretical limit on predictability of the weather. The weather forecast might be quite accurate for a day or two and not too bad for several more days. But after that, the accuracy takes a nosedive. I also wanted to share reasons for optimism. It's not all the cautionary tale. Wilhelm Bjerknes was undaunted at his time that he could prepare a forecast because he was not so much interested in practical applications, but proof of concept. And the practical results came later. Speaking in 1913, he noted, "It may require many years to bore a tunnel through a mountain. Many a laborer may not live to see the cut finished. Nevertheless, this will not prevent later comers from riding through the tunnel at express train speed." Tangible results soon followed with the Bergen School methods, allowing for useful forecasts, at least for several days. And now modern technological methods allowing us ready access to real-time graphical nowcasts on our computers and smartphones. But back to the cautionary note to finish up here. Weather systems are exceedingly complex, as I mentioned, but they involve measurable and well-defined quantities subject to physical laws. Pandemics, as we all know, are orders of magnitude more complex, and they involve mutating and poorly understood viral agents, subject to both biological and physical principles, as well as the vagaries of human behavior, both individual and collective. Perhaps we stand metaphorically, as Bjerknes described, with pickaxe and shovel, ready to tunnel through a mountain. Perhaps in relatively short order, we will have a surveillance system in place for pandemics, as we have for tropical storms. Yet we still have this cone of uncertainty. For example, a modern Category 3 storm like Hurricane Katrina became a heavy rain event within 24 hours. Yet it still devastated low-lying areas of New Orleans, in large part due to the failures of the human-built infrastructure. Perhaps global climate modeling and prediction provides an apt analogy, since it, like pandemic modeling and prediction, is a wicked problem with diverse, unbounded social entanglements. The Weather Service was actually started in 1870, and it was a military outfit. NOAA, our modern National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, dates to a reorganization of all that in 1970, a century later. But the Federal Agency for Weather Prediction was preceded by a university corporation for atmospheric research. This was mentioned too by the other speakers. But a Center for Forecasting and Analytics, which is really a wonderful idea. It also needs a sort of a National Center for Atmospheric Research, perhaps embedded in it or perhaps associated with it. Or more accurately, as we have in atmospheric science, a massive university corporation covering about 100 different university research groups, coordinated so we might learn how to understand and monitor pandemics, and not just aim at prediction and control, although we need to have that as well. I was seeing Jeffrey's opening sneeze graphic reminded me that there are now some opportunities for atmospheric scientists to get involved in the pandemics. A group I'm aware of is working on studying droplets actually they took their cloud physics instruments and sneezed into them to see what they could do to measure the behavior of sneezes. And they measured a 5-micron droplet with their cloud physics equipment. And since cloud droplets are typically much larger than 5, they're 20 microns in size, but clouds are able to float sometimes for very long distances across political and social boundaries. And clouds rain and snow on everyone. So I think there's a lot of hope here and a lot of initiative to move forward in predicting pandemics. But there's a lot more behind the history of weather and climate prediction by way of analogy that we could put into this equation. So thanks for your time, and I'll turn it back over to the group.
Thanks very much indeed, Jim. So now we're going to go to, we're going to basically engage in Q&A. So Wilmot has been collating some of the questions that have been coming in, and we'll be asking the panelists for their response on this. But Wilmot, do you want to kick off, or shall I kick off with an early start?
I'm happy to just harvest some of the questions in the chat. The one question comes from Kevin Olival and is directed at George and Caitlin. And the question is the following: how do you envision the National Center for Epidemic Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, how they will coordinate with relevant state and city institutes when it comes to outbreak modeling. So, for example, he says the proposed 20 million New York City Pandemic Response Institute. And then finally he asks, similarly, how will it be structured to leverage expertise in academia and the nonprofit sector? It's a question for Dylan and for Caitlin.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off and then Caitlin can join in. But it's you know, first off, both Caitlin and I are not in the federal government, and so this is just like what we think that it should be. And so this is just to be clear on that. But as I mentioned in my comments, where the rubber hits the road in the United States context, at least, for public health decisions at the local level. And so we need to be able to figure out how to support mayors and governors in making decisions more quickly, better, faster, stronger in some way. And so there has to be a very strong interface at the state and local level with the results that are going forward and trying to interpret those results. That's why we talked about, you know, this R&D component, this operational component, and this decision support component. That's the measure of success. Are we doing that? Are we helping those decisions being moved forward more effectively? So it's not clear how that's going to materialize, but that is the intent going forward. Now, to the question about how is academia, nonprofits, and civil society going to interface with this, again, that will be determined, but there is the intent both to engage academia and civil society in improving the science, developing out new capabilities and design, build, test new capabilities in the localities, but then also in framing the overall structure of this. There is a lot of a desire to figure out what is that process and how do we bring all the stakeholders along to define what this is. And again, I'm speaking as an individual, not as somebody that is representing the federal government in any capacity, but I'll pass it over to Caitlin to see if there's anything else that she wanted to add there too.
Yeah, I would just add that right now, a lot of these activities are being run out of academia. And I think our vision is to say, let's keep doing that because that is where a lot of the expertise is, but let's make sure that we also have the operational capability that we can pivot to put to response activities. Researchers are good at doing research but there's a lot of space left for people who are great at interfacing with state and local public health officials who are great at helping to support decision makers. And so it's really about growing and building on that academic base into something that is more easily able to be put to a response mode.
So thank you very much. If I may, Alex, there's one more question. That's a follow-up question.
Yeah.
From Mark Stoner, who says that I'm interested from a venture capital investor perspective to invest in companies that are working on solutions for advanced warning systems and forecasting outbreaks. Will we see the data help investors decide what companies or researchers to back? This question is not directed to any one of our individual speakers, so it's put to anybody who would like to take that up.
I'll take a stab at it right away. It's like the organization that I work at right now is In-Q-Tel, which is a strategic investor. We operate very similarly to a venture capital firm, but we invest in venture-backed startup companies for the federal government. So our LP is the federal government, and so it's instead of getting return on investment, we're focused on actually enabling technology transfer to the federal government in some capacity for a range of different technologies. And so I do think that there is an ecosystem of data systems and data companies out there that are going to be critical going forward in improving the whole kind of data supply chain. So how do we collect data more effectively? How do we clean and aggregate data? How do we actually then analyze it? How do we visualize it and then present it? And then how do we interpret it more effectively for decision support? All along that data supply chain, there's going to be component parts of and technologies that are going to be very useful. I think the biggest challenge and frustration is going to be, it's like, how to do those technologies and companies interface with the healthcare system and the public health system within the United States. And that's always been a bit of a challenge because it's not a full market system. It's a warped system that the payers and providers are disaggregated from one another and moving forward. But I am very encouraged based on what I've seen at In-Q-Tel and then some of the trends that we've seen over COVID over the past little while, that there will be more and more opportunities to move forward. I think that the interest in telehealth, the interest in at-home sampling and testing, the interest in wearables and digital technologies for improving clinical trials or just even monitoring individuals, the quantified self, I think are all showing that there's going to be lots of opportunities for venture-backed startups for technologies moving forward.
Maybe I could come in with a question on social sciences side, if that's okay, Wilmot. So we're getting some questions in the chat. There was one from Andrew Schroeder, but also Colby Wilkinson, who says, thank you for this discussion. How will the work coming out of the Forecasting Center coordinate and or align with more behavioral sciences to understand communities' propensity to respond and therefore impact transmission of an outbreak? In that line, will it take into account misinformation and false narratives around both diseases, as well as national local responses to those diseases? I can't imagine what they're talking about there. Anyway, but there is actually, it was pretty clear that with the Ebola outbreak, the solution wasn't just around vaccines, it was around social anthropology and understanding what was happening on the ground to people and the way they buried people, etc. So how does the Forecasting Center work in that respect? Because as Andrew Schroeder pointed out, this is not like the weather. This is around actually people and how they're going to change things differently. I'd be interested to hear what Caitlin and Dylan think, but also hear from Jeff and Jim if they've got perspectives on how things have been happening recently or in the historical past.
Sure, I can start. So it's true that human behavior is one big difference between weather forecasting and disease forecasting. Disease processes are fairly straightforward to study and understand and codify, but human behavior is a lot more dynamic. It's more difficult to understand and anticipate. But I think nonetheless, incorporating behavior data into our modeling approaches is one of the biggest areas of opportunity. And one of the places where I think this kind of investment and attention to developing models will be able to yield great results. There's a lot we can do around better understanding how do people react in the setting of an infectious disease outbreak? What are the ways that we can intervene in those behaviors, and how can we translate that into the language of models? And so I think that this is going to be an important area of growth for the field that we've really only just begun to understand and scratch the surface of.
I can add in on this. This is going to be an increasingly important issue, and it's certainly possible with wearables coming in and the swell of information that may come out from individuals, selectively those who are self-volunteering to do so, information on some of the microscale processes that are really critical to understand to help control diseases. The COVID pandemic has made this eminently evident, but we still haven't been able to crack it. We know, for instance, that face masks are effective, but we have a very difficult time quantifying it because we can't observe actual face mask usage, the quality of them, whether somebody's wearing them over their nose and mouth or hanging them off their chin, how much of the time they actually effectively wear it out of the house. We have proxies for mobility. We even have these Bluetooth engagement that Apple and Google have come up with for trying to peg proximity. They're going to be interesting devices and opportunities for improving our ability to understand the behaviors that are actually presenting opportunities for person-to-person transmission, particularly for something as invisible as a respiratory disease transmission event. And as behavior feeds into that, as we develop better indicators for it, and it doesn't all have to be technological, this really does need to be incorporated into these models. They're critical, and I think, getting back to my idea of this difference between projection and forecasting, when you look at what we've been able to do for the COVID-19 pandemic, it really is projection because it's all conditional probabilities. It's if-then statements. If society and individuals do this, then this is what we might see in the future. And the problem is that if is all wrapped up in behavior. What kind of compliance will there be in social distancing, restrictions on mass gatherings, usage of face masks? Until we're able to actually observe that, that's going to be a hole in our ability to actually project with greater accuracy what will happen in the future with infectious diseases.
Yeah, and I'll chip in. I think there's very close analogy here between the pandemic forecasting and the weather forecasting, because if you look at it historically over a really long period, human expectations have been co-produced with the increasing ability to forecast the weather. And I think the examples we're giving are from our current pandemic, but human behavior is malleable, and it does respond to these advances in forecasting. So you're going to end up changing expectations for the health system as you go.
Yeah, the only other last thing I would say to the otherwise excellent comments that have already been pointed out is the weather analogy is an imperfect analogy. It is not, you know, completely apt in all the cases. And so we fully appreciate that as well. If there's other analogies that people find more compelling, would love to, you know, have that discussion with folks too. It is useful for helping think through what are the components and then learning from, you know, what are the major kind of efforts that were necessary for moving forward advanced analytics in a different field. The last other thing I would point out though too is that there is some encouraging efforts going on right now in the National Science Foundation. They are in the process of scoping out a program where they're going to bring in social behavior and economic components and trying to think through how to augment epidemiological models going forward. And so I'm very encouraged by those efforts going forward. Those are to be determined on how they're going to be rolled out, but there's an explicit agreement among many people in the academic community that we need to understand these things at a much finer granularity, as Jeff was pointing out, going forward. Yeah, totally agree.
I could just join in. So I know Jim from years ago when the two of us led a program on the history and future of climate change. And my own, particular interest is more generally provision. How do big institutions, organizations try to predict and plan for catastrophic threats? And one of the consistent themes in that history is how frequently different forms of provision are confused and misused. And this is sometimes the fault of the experts, but the public, I think, in many cases doesn't necessarily understand the difference between a forecast versus a projection versus a scenario. And we've seen this over and over and over again in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I would hope that this new center, has a public education component. And more generally, I hope that more researchers begin to work across different domains, because there are really interesting connections and parallels between how it is we try to anticipate different kinds of threats. And we can absolutely learn from one another. As historians, we never think that the analogies are going to give us the answers. What they're really for is to provoke questions that might not occur to us otherwise. So that's really the most useful thing about looking at past efforts and also kind of look across different domains.
I think the communication challenges that you just raised are one of the one example of why we think it's so important to grow this out into an operational capability. The people building the models might not be the right people to communicate the models. We know from the weather community that they underwent a very specific and focused effort to understand how best to communicate emergency weather alerts, for example. Do you put it out 5 minutes ahead? I'm going to get this wrong because there are weather experts on the line, but there's been a lot of work that's gone in very specifically to understanding how to motivate behavior change. And I think we have the opportunity to do that here based on disease forecast. We're just not in position to do it right now with mostly researchers at the helm.
So there's a sort of slightly related issue here in the chat, which is from Laurie Garrett, who talks about the politics of data. So it's one thing for people to have, their own personal views about, infections or data, but the politicians, leaders often have reasons to stifle, block, or distort data. Again, really hard to imagine, but it could be true. Starting at sampling and working all the way up the food chain. What does this matter? I mean, of course, it matters hugely because pandemics are global. So it matters hugely when you're thinking about the international impact of this. Any thoughts about this that go beyond just the personal human aspects to political weaponizing of data?
There are many and various challenges with data, and not all of them are technological, but I will say one of the best ways to understand the quality of the data you're receiving without any additional context is to have ongoing analysis. and to be able to interrogate those data from a lot of different directions, matching it to your expectations, matching it to other jurisdictions. And so having in place analytical capabilities to be able to do that regularly will actually, I think, drive us to better understand what the problems with our data are.
And the other thing I would add to this, though, too, is like, having worked in the Obama administration where, was able to see the full force of the federal government moving and what it could do during the Ebola response, and then seeing it essentially on the bench during COVID was just broke my heart. And that's why, as we were talking about this center, we wanted to figure out how do we support the state and local decision makers. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that it's not all state mayors and governors are going to follow kind of guidance from the evidence base that this center would generate. But if we can scale what we've seen in other places to more places that don't have access to it right now, that would be a way of bolstering some of the challenges with politics. It's a thorny issue, and I completely agree with you that we need to think that through more deeply.
I would also add, remarkably, even it's crept into the weather. We had a hurricane cone of uncertainty that was expanded before the pandemic, for instance, for political reasons as well. It's something that we just have to work to establish trusted, reliable sources of data. And if you can build out a national center, and if you can work on some of the communication issues that Caitlin spoke to, and you can build out the trust from the public for the system, it will become harder for it to be weaponized for political purposes. I am also not naive enough to believe that that can't happen, but that's what you need to do. But I would also add that there are enormous data issues associated with infectious diseases that are perhaps even larger than these political issues, and that has to do with the privatization of data that really need to be in the public domain if you're going to make effective analytic and informed forecasting decisions. We have enormous amounts of medical records that are privatized, that are held by medical billing record companies, that are inaccessible for use by forecasters for doing something for the greater public good, but which are bought and sold by companies who gain access to them. And this is something that a national conversation on really would be welcome, to find ways of bringing these data for use in a way that respects people's privacies, perhaps brings to light how they are being used right now that people are not necessarily aware of, but can be leveraged for the public good. And so that's a very large subject that needs to be dealt with as this center is built out.
So as a former politician, if there's such a thing, I just wanted to say that what's also required on top of this is to build and find political champions for doing the right thing. And that has to be done in a deliberate way. It's not just an accident. You have to find them, you have to support them, and you have to make sure that they have the ability to speak out. And that's really quite important, because we must also get the politics right on this. So if you get the science right, you get the data right, you also have to get the politics right. So I just wanted to say that. We have 10 minutes left. I wanted us to spend a bit of time, if that's okay, on talking about how the National Center, what the plan is for building it, what the steps are, what the stages are. There's a question in the chat from Catherine Herzog, where she asks, she's curious, she says, about the span of specialities and professions that is envisioned in this forecasting center. How can current epidemiologists and or disease ecologists prepare to be part of this? And how will the center interface with the CDC and HSS? Let me also just add that there is great interest in replicating the center globally, not at the same resource base, clearly. If you want to do this in Africa, it's a much more challenged environment. But the idea of a forecasting center and improving data collection, not only for infectious diseases, but also for weather, also for all other climate-related issues, is of great importance. And so I think it'd be really interesting to speak about how the center is going to be built up over the next year and what the opportunities for replication would be globally. And for my end, that's a question I'd like to start off with Dylan and Caitlin.
So I'll start off with, and then Caitlin can jump in. But it's the National Security Memo #1 calls for the National Security Advisor to plan to establish the center. And so it resides with the White House to actually come up with a plan to establish going forward. The dollars are at CDC, so there's resources available. They're going to have to come together with a process to engage external stakeholders to actually form how this is going to go forward. Those discussions assuredly are happening on what is the appropriate process to build that out and to move that forward. I would highlight, I mean, Wilmot makes the excellent point though too, is that there's other places in the world that have done this fairly well. I mean, there's models that we can look to. Hong Kong has done this fairly well. The Netherlands has done this kind of concept fairly well, and the United Kingdom has done this fairly well. And so we can learn from what has worked well there and what hasn't worked well there to try to generate capabilities here in the United States. And then also there are ongoing efforts. I know that Rick Bright and the Rockefeller Foundation are very interested in trying to develop global early warning capabilities going forward. And so there's lots of interest in trying to move these efforts going forward in a sustained way. It's somewhat of a non-satisfying answer because the processes yet have to become apparent and move forward and developed. But I'm confident that the government is actually putting those into place so that we can understand how those people can actually participate in forming this. In terms of the specialities, clearly we're going to need, quantitative people. We're going to need data technologists. We're going to need, social behavioral expertise to actually make the data move, to analyze the data, and then to communicate the data. Caitlin also pointed out, it's like describing the nuance and complexity of some of these results into a policy context is not a straightforward thing to do. And just because you can create the model doesn't mean you can actually explain it to politicians. And so we're going to have to develop that skill set as well. So it's going to be a fairly complex endeavor, but I'm hopeful given the mandate and the resources that are available right now. Over to Caitlin, if there's anything else that you think on that one.
The only thing to add is that the language right now resides with the administration and the dollars are until expended. And so proper legislative language of a legislative vehicle to institutionalize and keep more permanent the center, and annual appropriations would be a boost as well. So we make sure that we don't make this ephemeral, that it's something lasting and enduring.
So thank you very much. There are a range of really good questions in the chat. We didn't get to those, but we will answer those questions. There's one question that's directed at Jeff. I think, let me just share that with you. So perhaps you can quickly answer that one. And it says, predicting pandemics, can it really be realized in reality? And if it is, what are the complications that we face to realize this functionality? So here's a doubtful comment coming, and I think it'd be important to respond to it.
So there are two issues here, and Dylan spoke to it earlier. If we're talking about forecasting diseases that are present in society, that are recurrent or have emerged, and trying to predict where they're going to go, what the burden will be, how many cases of flu or SARS-CoV-2 or West Nile virus or malaria there is in a particular place where it's already present. That kind of forecasting is possible to different degrees and has been done over the last 10 years operationally. The CDC has been using seasonal flu forecasts. There have been efforts to implement this for dengue, for other diseases as well. And it's certainly something that can be done. The accuracy, the reliability, the calibration of the forecasts need to be improved substantially, and that comes about from all the research we were talking about in terms of improving the models, improving the observations, improving understanding of behavior, bringing all that in a way so that you can provide better information along the way. On the other side, if you're talking about predicting the emergence of a new pathogen, if you're talking about being able to predict the 2014 Ebola outbreak before it happens, if you're talking about being able to predict the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 before it happened, That's an issue that has really intrigued people for a number of decades, and there's been a considerable investment in it from the federal government. Projects like PREDICT, the DARPA, the defense, I forget what DARPA stands for, even though I've had funding from them, but part of the DoD, they've actually invested considerable amounts of money in it. The caution that I would make there is that it's very difficult to point to an example of predictions made for an event that has never been observed. I don't think you can find it in any field, to be perfectly honest. Our ability to predict the weather is because we understand the weather, because we understand the dynamics and the thermodynamics and the radiative processes of the atmosphere, because we've observed them. And even though they're nonlinear, we can build something out for it. When you don't know a actual process, it's very difficult to make a prediction for it. However, there are ways of assessing risk. There are very interesting ways that are coming out for understanding reservoirs of disease, what kinds of animals that we haven't actually seen before that may be more likely to carry diseases that have the capacity to infect humans and actually foment sustained person-to-person transmission. There are really interesting ways of doing it in a sort of risk assessment way that may not be able to tell you that on June 3rd, 2026, somewhere in Cambodia, there will be a spillover of the next global pandemic, but rather allow you to say, where do we need to do the surveillance more? Where do we need to keep an eye on things? Where do we need to improve our capacity? And what are the animal systems and locations that we need to monitor in greater detail? So while I may have presented it in sort of a more skeptical light in terms of applying the kinds of quantitative methods that we're talking about for forecasting of diseases that are out there and among us already, there are other methods that can be brought to bear to actually help protect us and realize where threats may be coming from.
If I could just say one word on that from a policy perspective as well. I absolutely agree with Jeff that the science of predicting disease emergence is probably not to the point where we can rely upon it to give us the earliest of warning systems. But one observation that I've made and that I think Dylan shares over the course of years of doing this is that it's rarely early detection that is the bottleneck. There's often a long delay between when we realize there is a problem and when we feel inspired to move against it and to really react. Part of the value, I think, of modeling and analytics is it can build more confidence in decision makers, the people responsible for really pushing go, by helping them to understand what are the possible future scenarios and how might interventions change the course of those scenarios. And so I think early action is just as important as early detection.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're about to close. Before I hand it over back to Matt to close, I wanted to ask whether Alex had any last comments to make.
Just thank you. Apologize, my phone went off. But actually, it was brilliant to have such an interesting mixture of people here. And also, it's great to be excited about a future vision for doing something big in the way that America always has been good at doing. So I think it's great to be talking about how to plan for the future in this way.
That sounds even better with your accent, Alex. If Americans say that, I would be unsettled.
Yeah.
Before I wrap up, because I want to thank Wilmot and I want to thank everyone, but Jim, you had your hand up a moment ago. Did you
That's fine. I wanted to speak for the long term moving forward, that since we're in such a long-term effort, as Caitlin mentioned, I think we need multiple seminars and educational opportunities to bring in all kinds of talent. You know, Gro Harlem Brundtland said we need all of our expertise to address the climate issue, and also the intergenerational, that we'll be training and educating new people. So that's a really great opportunity going forward.
And, you know, I serve as the Social Science Institute at Columbia. We're very hopeful, and we've already begun talking with Alex and with Jeff and others across Columbia about how we can support the new climate school and how social scientists can join with other scientists in moving that vision forward. But just to close, I want to once again thank Wilmot James. I want to thank all of our panelists. And as I want to thank all of our partners in supporting this series. You'll see at the beginning of the chat, the other talks we've had, do have a look. But we've had a lot of help and support from programs in global health, the Evangelist College of Physicians and Surgeons, the Earth Institute, the Data Science Institute, and our publishing partner, the Academy of Political Science. And a special thanks to Carlo Wang, iSearch's program coordinator, and Lorraine Morales-Cando of the Academy of Political Science. So thank you everyone for joining, and until next time.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.